The Galactic Academy's emergency alarm pierced through the corridors like a wounded beast, its shrill cry echoing off the polished metal walls. In classroom 7 Alpha, 43 students from 12 different species sat frozen in their seats, their various appendages trembling with terror. The sound meant only one thing: incoming asteroid field, all hands to emergency stations. Professor Zelrak, a tall crystalline being whose translucent body flickered with nervous purple light, stood at the front of the class, his 6 arms gesticulating wildly. Students, remain calm. This is a class 3 emergency drill. Follow emergency protocols immediately. The classroom erupted into chaos. The Vorthan students, with their butterfly-like wings, began fluttering frantically toward the emergency exits. The reptilian Skarn hissed and clicked their claws against their desks, instinctively seeking the lowest points in the room. 3 young Zephyrians turned pale blue with fear, their tentacles writhing as they accessed their racial memory banks for survival protocols. "Why aren't the blast shields activating?" squeaked Chris, a small, furry Million whose whiskers twitched with anxiety. Her species had evolved on a peaceful world where the worst natural disaster was a particularly heavy rainfall. "Because this isn't a drill," whispered Gorak, a massive Thurian whose rock-like hide was turning gray with stress. His deep, rumbling voice carried the weight of someone whose planet regularly dealt with meteor strikes. "I can feel the vibrations through the ship's hull. Something big is heading our way." The other students heard this, and panic spread like wildfire. Several of the younger Aquarian students began making high-pitched distress calls that sounded like dolphins in terror. The Mentari, being telepathic, started picking up everyone's fear and amplifying it back, creating a feedback loop of dread that filled the room. Professor Zelrak tried to maintain order, but his own fear was showing. His crystalline form had shifted from its usual calm blue to a deep red, and small cracks were appearing along his surface, a sure sign of extreme stress in his species. "Students, please, follow the evacuation procedures. Move in an orderly fashion to emergency Bay 12. But nobody was listening anymore. The alarm continued its relentless wailing, and through the large viewport that dominated one wall of the classroom, they could see the asteroid field approaching. Massive chunks of rock and ice tumbled through space, some as large as small moons, their surfaces scarred and jagged from eons of cosmic collisions. It was Lyra, a young Elysian with silver skin and large, luminous eyes, who first noticed the anomaly. Her species was known for their keen observational skills, and something in the far corner of the classroom had caught her attention. "Professor," she called out, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "What about the human?" Every head in the classroom turned to look at the back corner, where a lone human sat slumped in his chair. While 42 alien students panicked and their professor frantically tried to organize an evacuation, Marcus Chun remained fast asleep, his head resting peacefully on his crossed arms, dark hair falling across his face. "By the 7 suns," breathed Professor Zelrak, his color shifting to an amazed yellow-green. How was he sleeping through this? The human's breathing was slow and steady, completely unaffected by the deafening alarm that had every other species in the room covering their auditory organs. His body was relaxed, showing none of the tension that radiated from every other living being in the room. "Is he dead?" asked Jenna, a crystalline student whose voice cracked with worry. Her people were always concerned about biological life forms and their fragility. "No, look," Lyra pointed with one delicate finger. "His chest is rising and falling. He's definitely breathing." "But how?" demanded Rix, a young Corvin whose scales were standing on end with agitation. "My species has enhanced hearing, and that alarm is so loud it's making my brain hurt. How can any living creature sleep through this?" The asteroid field was getting closer now, visible as individual rocks tumbling through space. The ship's automated systems began announcing updates in multiple languages. Emergency protocol in effect. All students and staff report to emergency stations immediately. Impact probability increasing. Still, Marcus slept on. Professor Zelrak found himself torn between evacuating his students and studying this impossible phenomenon. In all his years of teaching at the Galactic Academy, he had never seen anything like this. Perhaps, he said, his voice filled with academic curiosity despite the danger, we should wake him? What if this is some kind of human defense mechanism? Suggested Corey, a Nexalian whose silver fur was standing straight up. Maybe when humans sense danger, they enter some kind of protective coma? That doesn't make sense, argued Gorak, his massive form shifting nervously. If danger approaches, you either fight or flee. Sleeping is the opposite of survival. The conversation was interrupted by another announcement. All personnel, asteroid impact estimated in 17 minutes. Proceed to emergency stations immediately. The remaining students who hadn't already fled began moving toward the exits, but they kept looking back at the sleeping human. There was something deeply unsettling about his peaceful slumber in the face of potential death. It defied every survival instinct that evolution had programmed into intelligent species across the galaxy. "Should we carry him?" asked Tam, a strong Goliath whose people were known for their protective instincts. His 4 arms flexed as he considered the logistics of moving an unconscious human. "Don't wake him yet," said Professor Zelrak, his scientific mind overriding his survival instincts. "This could be incredibly important data. Humans are the newest species to join the Galactic Federation. We know so little about their biology and psychological responses to stress." The irony wasn't lost on anyone that while they debated what to do about the sleeping human, they were all becoming increasingly terrified. The millions in the class had begun to shed their fur in patches, a stress response that left small clouds of silver fluff floating through the air. The Skarn students were now pressed flat against the floor, their bodies instinctively trying to merge with any available surface. Through the viewport, the asteroid field loomed larger and larger. Some of the rocks were close enough now that they could see details on their surfaces. Ancient impact craters, veins of crystallized ice, and metal deposits that gleamed in the light of distant stars. The largest asteroid, roughly spherical and covered in a maze of cracks, was on a direct collision course with their section of the ship. 14 minutes to impact, announced the ship's computer in its maddeningly calm voice. That's when Lyra noticed something else. While studying the sleeping human, she had been watching his vital signs through the biomonitoring system that all students wore. "Professor," she said, her voice filled with amazement, "look at his readings." The display showed Marcus's heart rate, a steady 68 beats per minute. His brain waves indicated deep, restful sleep. His stress hormone levels were so low they barely registered on the scanner. For comparison, the display also showed the readings for the other students in the room. Heart rates ranged from 120 to 200 beats per minute. Stress hormones were off the charts. Brain activity showed patterns consistent with extreme fear and panic. "That's impossible," whispered Professor Zelrak. "No known species can maintain such calm biological functions in the face of mortal danger. It violates every principle of evolutionary psychology we understand." The sleeping human had become more fascinating to them than the approaching asteroids. Here was a being so fundamentally different from everything they knew about life and survival that it challenged their most basic assumptions about consciousness itself. As the ship's automated systems continued their countdown and the last few students fled toward the emergency stations, Professor Zelrak made a decision that would change everything he thought he knew about humans. Instead of evacuating, he stayed to observe, determined to understand this impossible creature who could sleep peacefully while death approached from the void. The asteroid field filled the viewport now, and individual rocks could be seen tumbling past the ship. The impact was less than 10 minutes away, and Marcus Chun continued sleeping, as peaceful as a child in his mother's arms, completely unaware that his unconscious behavior was rewriting the textbooks on xenobiology across the galaxy. The ship shuddered as the first small asteroid fragments struck the outer hull. Emergency lights bathed classroom 7 Alpha in pulsing red, casting eerie shadows across the now empty seats. Professor Zelrak had dimmed the main lights to better observe his subject, and, in the crimson glow, Marcus Chun looked almost ethereal as he continued his impossible sleep. Impact in 7 minutes, the computer announced with its usual mechanical precision. Professor Zelrak had activated his personal recording device, documenting what might be the most significant xenobiological discovery of the century. Personal log, Professor Zelrak, emergency timestamp 7741.3. Subject, human student Marcus Chun, age 19 standard years. Observation, subject maintains deep sleep state during class. 3 emergency. Biological readings remain at baseline despite imminent threat to life. The ship's structure groaned around them as larger debris struck the hull. Through the viewport, they could now see individual asteroids the size of buildings tumbling past, some close enough to touch if the transparent aluminum weren't in the way. The largest asteroid, their primary concern, now filled half the view, its cratered surface growing larger by the second. That's when Zelrak noticed something odd about the human's positioning. While Marcus appeared to be sleeping casually, his body had somehow shifted during the past few minutes. His feet were now firmly planted on the floor, his center of gravity perfectly balanced despite being hunched over the desk. His hands, which had been loosely folded, were now positioned in a way that would allow him to spring into action instantly. Curious, Zelrak murmured, adjusting his recording device. Subject appears to have unconsciously adopted a more stable position. Perhaps some form of subliminal awareness of the situation. The ship suddenly lurched to the left as the navigation systems activated emergency thrusters, trying to avoid the largest incoming asteroid. Every loose object in the classroom slid across the floor, chairs toppled over, and Zelrak himself had to grab onto his desk to avoid falling. Marcus didn't even shift in his seat. Impossible, Zelrak whispered. The G-forces from that maneuver should have thrown him across the room. But there the human sat, apparently unbothered by physics itself. His breathing remained slow and steady, his face peaceful. If anything, he looked more comfortable than before, as if the chaos around him was nothing more than a gentle lullaby. The viewport suddenly filled with rock as the massive asteroid swept past, so close that its irregular surface dominated their entire field of vision. Zelrak could see veins of ice running through the ancient stone, metal deposits that had been compressed by eons of pressure, and deep craters that spoke of violent collisions in the distant past. 3 minutes to impact, the computer announced. That's when Marcus stirred for the first time. It wasn't a dramatic awakening. There was no sudden jerking or panicked flailing. Instead, the human simply raised his head slowly, blinked a few times, and looked around the empty classroom with mild curiosity. His movements were fluid and relaxed, showing no signs of the disorientation that typically accompanied awakening from deep sleep. "Oh, hey, Professor," Marcus said, his voice casual and unstressed. "Did I miss something important?" Professor Zelrak found himself speechless. His crystalline form flickered through several colors as his mind tried to process what he was witnessing. Finally, he managed to stammer. "Miss something? Marcus, we're about to be hit by an asteroid. There's a class 3 emergency in progress. How could you possibly sleep through the alarms?" Marcus looked around again, this time noticing the emergency lighting and the empty seats. Through the viewport, the asteroid field was clearly visible, with rocks the size of small cities drifting past their position. He watched this display of cosmic violence with the same mild interest someone might show when looking at fish in an aquarium. "Oh, that," he said with a slight shrug. "Yeah, I heard it. Sounded like a drill to me." "A drill?" Zelrak's voice cracked with disbelief. "The ship's computers have been announcing the emergency for the past 20 minutes. How could you possibly think this was a drill?" Marcus stretched, his joints popping with the sound of someone who had been in a comfortable position for a long time. "Well, the alarm was too regular, for one thing. Real emergencies don't have such consistent patterns. And the ship's movements were too controlled. If we were really about to get smashed by rocks, the artificial gravity would be fluctuating more. As if on cue, the ship's gravity systems hiccuped, causing Zelrak to float briefly before settling back down. Marcus, somehow, remained perfectly seated throughout the fluctuation. Besides, Marcus continued, apparently unaware that he had just defied physics again. If this were a real emergency, they would have sent security to evacuate the classroom by now. The fact that we're still here means someone wants to see how we react to stress. Impact in 90 seconds, the computer announced helpfully. Marcus, Zelrak said urgently, I assure you this is not a drill. We need to evacuate immediately. But the human just smiled and shook his head. Professor, with respect, I've been through emergency drills my whole life. Fire drills, earthquake drills, tornado drills, active shooter drills, nuclear attack drills. This has all the hallmarks of a training exercise designed to test psychological responses to extreme stress. Through the viewport, they could see the massive asteroid approaching their section of the ship. It was close enough now that they could make out individual boulders on its surface, some the size of school buses. The ship's automated defense systems had activated, filling space with bright flashes as they tried to break up the incoming debris. 60 seconds to impact. You see, Marcus said, gesturing toward the light show outside. If this were real, those defensive systems would have been activated much earlier. The timing is all wrong for a genuine emergency. This is clearly a psychological experiment. Professor Zelrak felt his mind reeling. Everything the human said was technically correct. The timing of the defensive systems was unusual. The ship's responses had been more measured than typical for a real emergency. But that didn't explain how Marcus could remain so calm while facing what appeared to be certain death. Even if you're correct about this being a drill, Zelrak said, how can you remain so composed? Your stress hormones haven't increased at all. Your heart rate is actually lower than it was when you were sleeping. This violates everything we know about intelligent life's response to perceived danger. Marcus considered this for a moment, watching as another wave of defensive fire lit up the space around them. I guess it's just a human thing, he said finally. We've learned to stay calm in dangerous situations because panic gets you killed. My species has been dealing with existential threats for our entire evolutionary history. Asteroid impacts, supervolcano eruptions, ice ages, predators that could eat us whole. If we panicked every time something threatened us, we would have gone extinct long before we developed space travel. 30 seconds to impact. But surely, Zelrak pressed, some part of your subconscious must recognize the danger. Some primitive survival instinct. Marcus looked thoughtful. Oh, I'm definitely aware we could die here. But worrying about it won't change the outcome. Either the ship's defenses will work, or they won't. Either this is a drill, and we're safe, or it's real, and our fate is out of our hands. Panicking would just make the experience more unpleasant without improving our chances of survival. The viewport was now completely filled with asteroid surface. Individual rocks and ice deposits were visible in incredible detail. The ship's final layer of defenses activated, creating a brilliant display of energy weapons that turned chunks of incoming debris into glowing plasma. 10 seconds to impact. Professor Zelrak closed all 6 of his eyes and prepared for death, his crystalline form turning a deep purple with terror. Marcus simply watched the light show with interest, as calm as if he were sitting in a park watching fireworks. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The massive asteroid swept past the viewport, missing their section of the ship by less than a kilometer. The defensive systems had successfully fragmented the largest pieces, and the ship's navigation had carried them clear of the worst debris. Emergency concluded, the computer announced. All clear. Normal operations resuming. Professor Zelrak opened his eyes to find Marcus stretching again, apparently preparing to go back to sleep. Well, the human said casually, that was interesting. I'm still not entirely sure if it was real or a drill, but either way, it's over now. Are we going back to the lesson on xenobiology? Or should I catch up on my sleep? I've got advanced physics next period, and Professor Keth gets cranky when students fall asleep during her lectures. Zelrak stared at the human in absolute amazement. In 40 years of teaching, he had never encountered anything like this. Marcus Chun had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about courage, survival instincts, and the nature of intelligent life itself. Word of the sleeping human incident spread through the Galactic Academy faster than a quantum pulse transmission. By the next morning, Marcus Chun had become the most famous student on the station, though he seemed completely unaware of his newfound celebrity status. He attended his morning classes as usual, took notes on quantum mechanics, and even dozed off briefly during a particularly dry lecture on administrative law. Professor Zelrak, meanwhile, had spent the entire night reviewing his recordings and writing what would become the most downloaded research paper in the Academy's history, Anomalous Stress Response in Human Subjects, a case study in species-specific survival adaptations. The aftermath began during breakfast in the Academy's main dining hall, a vast space that could accommodate the dietary needs of dozens of species. Marcus sat alone at his usual table, methodically working through what appeared to be some kind of Earth breakfast involving flat, circular bread discs covered in a sweet syrup. "Excuse me," came a tentative voice from behind him. "Are you the human who slept through the asteroid attack?" Marcus looked up to see 3 students standing nervously nearby. Lyra the Elysian, Chris the Million, and Gorak the Massive Thurian. All 3 had been in the classroom during the incident, and all 3 looked at Marcus with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Oh, hey," Marcus said, gesturing to the empty chairs around his table. "You guys want to sit? I think there might have been some confusion about what happened yesterday." The 3 exchanged glances before cautiously taking seats. Chris, whose tiny form barely reached the table's surface, even with her chair's height adjustments, spoke first. "Confusion? Marcus, you slept through a class 3 emergency. The entire ship nearly got destroyed, and you didn't even wake up until it was almost over." "Right," Marcus said, taking another bite of his breakfast. "That's what I wanted to talk about. I wasn't actually sleeping through the emergency. I mean, I was sleeping, but I was also aware of what was happening." Gorak's rocky features shifted into what might have been confusion. "How can you be both sleeping and aware? That doesn't make sense." Marcus paused, seemingly searching for the right words. "It's hard to explain. Humans call it sleeping with one eye open. It's something we developed back when our ancestors had to worry about predators. We can rest our conscious minds while keeping our survival instincts alert. If there had been real danger, I would have woken up instantly." "But there was real danger," Lyra insisted, her large luminous eyes reflecting her bewilderment. "We could see the asteroids. The ship was damaged. People could have died. Marcus agreed. But the probability was actually pretty low. The ship's defensive systems were functioning normally. The structural integrity alarms never sounded, and the evacuation procedures were too orderly for a genuine crisis. My subconscious was monitoring all of that while I slept." Chris's whiskers twitched rapidly, a sign of intense thinking in her species. "You're saying your unconscious mind was performing threat assessment while you slept?" "Something like that. Humans are really good at pattern recognition and risk calculation. It comes from millions of years of surviving on a planet that was constantly trying to kill us. We learned to distinguish between different types of threats and respond appropriately." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a tall, elegant figure. Dean Ashera, the Academy's highest-ranking administrator. The Valorian's golden skin seemed to shimmer as she walked, and her 4 arms moved with the practiced grace of someone used to command. "Mr. Chun," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had governed entire star systems. "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Marcus looked up from his breakfast. "Sure, Dean Ashera. Is this about yesterday? Because I want to apologize if I caused any disruption to the emergency procedures." The Dean's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a Valerian expression of surprise. "Apologize? Mr. Chun, you may have just revolutionized our understanding of crisis management. Professor Zelrak's preliminary report is already being studied by xenopsychologists across the galaxy." "Really?" Marcus seemed genuinely confused. I mean, all I did was sleep through a drill. That's precisely what we need to discuss. Would you be willing to participate in some additional testing? We'd like to understand more about human stress responses and survival mechanisms. Marcus shrugged. Sure, I guess. But I should warn you, I'm not particularly special. Most humans would react pretty much the same way I did. Dean Ashara's golden skin flickered with excitement. That Mr. Chun is exactly what makes this so fascinating. Later that day, Marcus found himself in Laboratory Complex 12, surrounded by some of the galaxy's most advanced biometric monitoring equipment. Dr. Vex, a crystalline researcher whose multifaceted body refracted light into rainbow patterns, attached various sensors to Marcus's arms and head. Now, Mr. Chun, Dr. Vex said, his voice resonating like wind chimes, we're going to simulate various emergency scenarios while monitoring your biological responses. Please just behave naturally. Okay, Marcus said, settling into a comfortable chair. Should I try to stay awake for this? Actually, we'd prefer if you could replicate yesterday's state. If you're able to sleep while remaining alert to danger, we'd very much like to study that phenomenon. Marcus nodded and closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing had slowed, and the biometric displays showed he had entered a sleep state. Dr. Vex began the first simulation, a fire alarm. The laboratory filled with the shrieking sound of emergency klaxons. Red lights flashed, and computer-generated voices announced evacuation procedures. Marcus's brain activity spiked briefly, but his heart rate remained steady, and he didn't wake up. Fascinating, murmured Dr. Vex. His higher brain functions are processing the auditory input, but his stress response systems aren't activating. It's as if his mind is categorizing this as not immediately life-threatening and filing it away. They tried several more scenarios: pressure loss warnings, toxic gas alerts, even simulated weapon fire. In each case, Marcus's sleeping mind seemed to evaluate the threat and dismiss it as either unlikely or manageable. His body remained relaxed, his vital signs stable. Then, Dr. Vex tried something different. Instead of a loud, obvious alarm, he activated a subtle simulation, the barely audible sound of structural metal beginning to stress and buckle, the kind of noise that might precede a catastrophic hull failure. Marcus was awake and on his feet in less than 2 seconds. Interesting, he said, looking around the laboratory with alert eyes. What was that sound? Dr. Vex's crystalline form sparkled with amazement. How did you know? The audio was played at barely detectable levels, and it wasn't part of any standard emergency protocol. It sounded like metal fatigue, Marcus explained, settling back into his chair. That's the kind of noise you hear right before something important breaks. My brain is wired to wake up for sounds like that. But you slept through fire alarms, pressure warnings, all the standard emergency signals. Marcus nodded. Those are artificial sounds designed to get attention. But they're also sounds that indicate help is on the way, that someone knows about the problem and is responding to it. The metal fatigue sound is different. That's the sound of imminent structural failure with no warning system, no response protocol. That's the kind of thing that could kill you before you knew it was happening. Dr. Vex made rapid notes on his holographic displays. So your subconscious mind is not just monitoring for danger, but specifically for the type of danger that requires immediate personal action? I guess so. Humans are pretty good at distinguishing between someone else's problem and definitely going to die if I don't do something right now. The testing continued for several hours, with Marcus demonstrating an uncanny ability to sleep through obvious, managed dangers while instantly awakening to subtle signs of genuine threat. When they played the sound of approaching footsteps with an irregular gait suggesting injury or hostile intent, he woke immediately. When they simulated the barely perceptible vibration pattern that might indicate a predator moving through nearby vegetation, his eyes snapped open. But massive explosions, blaring sirens, and dramatic computer announcements barely registered on his sleeping mind's threat assessment scale. It's like your species has evolved to ignore panic and focus only on actionable intelligence, Dr. Vex observed. Well, Marcus said, panic never saved anyone. Action saves people. Our brains learned a long time ago to filter out the noise and focus on what actually matters. As the testing concluded, Dr. Vex found himself with more questions than answers. The human sleeping pattern wasn't just unusual, it was revolutionary. It suggested a level of threat assessment and risk management that exceeded anything seen in galactic civilization. Mr. Chun, Dr. Vex said as they prepared to leave, would you be willing to participate in more extensive studies? This could change how we approach emergency preparedness across all member species. Marcus shrugged. Sure, if it helps. But you might want to test other humans too. Like I said, I'm not special. This is just how we're built. Dr. Vex's crystalline form flickered through several colors as he contemplated the implications. If Marcus Chun was just an average human, and this level of crisis management was normal for his species, then perhaps the galaxy had seriously underestimated Earth's newest members. The thought was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. 3 weeks after the sleeping incident, the Galactic Academy had become a hub of intense scientific activity. Researchers from across the galaxy had descended upon the station, all eager to study the human who had slept through an asteroid field. Marcus Chun, for his part, seemed to take the attention in stride, treating the constant interviews and tests as a minor inconvenience between his regular studies. The breakthrough came during advanced combat simulation class, taught by Commander Thex, a battle-scarred Corvan veteran whose scales bore the marks of dozens of space battles. The class was designed to test students' reactions under extreme stress, using virtual reality scenarios that felt completely real to the participants. Today, Commander Thex announced to his mixed-species class, "We will be conducting survival scenarios. You will be placed in life-threatening situations and must demonstrate appropriate response protocols. Mr. Chun, given recent events, the research team will be monitoring your participation with particular interest." Marcus nodded from his seat in the back row, where he had been quietly reviewing notes from his previous class. Around him, students from various species prepared themselves mentally for what they knew would be an intense experience. The Skarn students were already showing stress patterns, their scales beginning to shift color. The millions had started their pre-combat grooming behaviors, frantically cleaning their fur. The first scenario began with all students finding themselves aboard a damaged spacecraft. The virtual reality was incredibly convincing. Emergency lights flickered, artificial gravity fluctuated randomly, and the sound of atmosphere venting created a constant background of terror. Most students immediately began following standard evacuation procedures, their voices high with simulated panic. Marcus, however, didn't move. While his classmates rushed toward escape pods and emergency stations, he stood perfectly still in the center of the damaged bridge, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. "Chun!" Commander Thex's voice crackled through the simulation. "What are you doing? This is an emergency evacuation scenario." "I know, sir," Marcus replied calmly, "but I don't think we're actually in immediate danger." "What?" The commander's voice carried genuine confusion. "The ship is losing atmosphere and falling toward a planet's gravity well. How can you possibly think there's no danger?" Marcus walked over to a damaged console and placed his hand on its surface. "The vibration patterns are wrong. If we were really losing atmosphere this quickly, the pressure differential would create different resonance frequencies in the hull. And the gravity fluctuations are too regular. Real gravitational field collapse doesn't pulse like that." While Marcus explained his reasoning, his fellow students continued their frantic evacuation efforts. Lyra had made it to an escape pod, Chris was following emergency protocols for her species, and Gorak was attempting to manually seal atmospheric breaches with his massive strength. Furthermore, Marcus continued, still perfectly calm, the damage patterns on these consoles suggest weapon fire, but there's no corresponding damage to the outer hull that would be visible from this angle. Someone's trying to create panic by simulating crisis conditions, but they didn't account for all the physical evidence. Commander Thex had been running combat simulations for over 30 standard years. Never once had a student analyze the scenario for inconsistencies instead of simply responding to it. Mr. Chun, even if you suspect this is a simulation, you should still demonstrate proper emergency protocols. Why? Marcus asked genuinely. If this were a real emergency, I'd be working to solve the actual problems instead of following evacuation procedures that won't help. And if it's a simulation designed to test our stress responses, then the most useful thing I can do is show you how humans actually think under pressure. The other students had finished their evacuations and were safely aboard escape pods, their virtual reality complete. But Marcus remained on the failing ship's bridge, calmly examining systems and offering running commentary on why the scenario wasn't realistic. The temperature readings are inconsistent with the supposed hull breaches, he said, checking another display. And the power distribution patterns suggest the main reactor is still operating normally, which contradicts the emergency lighting. This is definitely a test scenario, not a real crisis. Commander Thex ended the simulation early. As the virtual reality faded, the students found themselves back in the training room, most of them showing obvious signs of stress despite knowing they had never been in real danger. Sweat, elevated breathing, nervous movements all indicated their bodies had fully believed in the simulated peril. Marcus looked exactly the same as when the simulation had started. Mr. Chun, Commander Thex said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern. While your analysis was impressively thorough, you completely ignored standard safety protocols. In a real emergency, that could get you killed. Marcus considered this seriously. Sir, with respect, standard safety protocols are designed for situations where you don't have complete information about the threat. They're meant to keep people alive when they don't know what's really happening. But humans are really good at gathering and analyzing information quickly, even under stress. If I can figure out what's actually wrong, I can respond more effectively than just following generic procedures. But what if you're wrong? What if you misread the situation and there really is imminent danger? Then I adapt, Marcus said simply. Humans are good at that too. We've been dealing with unpredictable, life-threatening situations for our entire evolutionary history. Our survival strategy isn't based on following predetermined protocols. It's based on rapid assessment, flexible response, and continuous adaptation. Commander Thex had heard about human military history, of course. Every species in the galaxy had studied Earth's remarkably violent past as part of their cultural integration training. But he had assumed that was just primitive behavior that humans had evolved beyond. Seeing it in action was something entirely different. Let's try a different scenario, the commander decided. Something with less obvious inconsistencies. The second simulation placed all students in a hostile alien environment. They were part of an exploration team that had crash-landed on a planet filled with aggressive predators. The virtual reality was even more convincing this time. Realistic wildlife sounds, the scent of an alien jungle, even tactile feedback that made students feel branches scratching against their skin. Most students immediately began implementing their species' standard survival protocols. The Skarn dug defensive positions. The Millions climbed a high ground. The Thurians started gathering materials to build shelter. Marcus stood quietly for a moment, then began walking directly toward the sounds of the largest predators. Chun, Commander Thex called out. What are you doing now? Scouting, Marcus replied, moving through the virtual jungle with surprising stealth. I need to understand what we're dealing with before I can plan an effective response. That's incredibly dangerous. The safety protocols clearly state that survivors should establish a defensive perimeter first. Safety protocols assume you're dealing with a known threat, Marcus said, pausing to examine what appeared to be predator tracks in the virtual soil. But we don't know anything about these creatures. Their behavior patterns, their hunting methods, their weaknesses. Running away and hiding might just make us easier prey. Through the monitors, Commander Thex and the observing scientists watched Marcus methodically gather intelligence on the simulated predators. He observed their movement patterns, noted their apparent blind spots, and even identified what seemed to be territorial boundaries. Meanwhile, his classmates huddled in their defensive positions, growing more anxious with each passing moment as predator sounds echoed through the jungle around them. "I think I understand the situation now," Marcus announced after 20 minutes of observation. "These are pack hunters with primarily visual tracking. They're territorial, so they won't follow us if we leave their hunting grounds. And they're most active during daylight hours, so traveling at night would significantly reduce encounter probability." He had essentially solved the survival scenario by treating it as an information-gathering problem rather than a fear response. "Mr. Chun," Commander Thex said after ending the second simulation, "your approach is unprecedented. I've never seen a student gather that much tactical intelligence under survival stress." "It wasn't really stressful," Marcus admitted. "I mean, it was interesting and I had to pay attention, but it wasn't scary. Humans learned a long time ago that knowledge is the best defense against unknown threats. The more you understand about a dangerous situation, the less dangerous it becomes." The observing scientists exchanged amazed glances. Dr. Vex's crystalline form was practically glowing with excitement, and several researchers were taking rapid notes on their data tablets. After the class ended, Marcus was approached by Dr. Sarah Okafor, the head of the human psychology research team. Dr. Okafor was one of only 12 humans on the Academy staff, and she had been studying her own species' integration into galactic society. "Marcus," she said, "I need to ask you something important. Do you think other humans would handle these situations the same way you do?" Marcus looked thoughtful. "I don't know about exactly the same way, but probably similar approaches. I mean, this is basic human problem solving. When you don't know what's happening, you gather information. When you're facing a threat, you try to understand it instead of just running away. That's pretty standard for our species." Dr. Okafor nodded, but her expression was troubled. "Marcus, I think you need to understand something. The way you're approaching these situations isn't just unusual for other species. It's completely alien to them. What seems like basic common sense to you is utterly foreign to every other form of intelligent life we've encountered." "Really?" Marcus seemed genuinely surprised. "But it's such an obvious approach. How did other species survive long enough to develop space travel if they don't analyze threats before responding to them?" That, Dr. Okafor said, is exactly what everyone is trying to figure out. The emergency session of the Galactic Academy's Board of Directors took place in the station's most secure conference room, deep within the administrative sector. Representatives from 47 different species filled the chamber, their various forms creating a rainbow of colors, textures, and sizes that spoke to the incredible diversity of galactic civilization. Dean Ashera stood at the center podium, her four arms gesticulating as she addressed the assembly. "Colleagues, we are facing a paradigm shift in our understanding of intelligent life. The data we've gathered over the past month challenges fundamental assumptions about consciousness, survival, and the nature of sapience itself." Dr. Vex's crystalline form refracted light from his position near the front of the chamber. The human subject, Marcus Chun, represents either an incredible anomaly or the tip of an iceberg that could reshape our entire approach to xenopsychology. Ambassador Kreth, an elderly Valerian whose golden skin bore the intricate tattoos of high diplomatic rank, raised one of his four hands. "Dr. Vex, please clarify the scope of your findings. Are you suggesting that this behavior is typical of humans generally, or specific to this individual?" "That's precisely what we need to determine," Dr. Vex replied. "All evidence suggests that Mr. Chun considers his responses perfectly normal for his species. He has repeatedly stated that any human would react similarly." Commander Thex, still bearing his battle scars from decades of military service, stood to address the assembly. "If that's true, then we need to seriously reconsider humanity's role in the galaxy. I've tested Mr. Chun in scenarios that would break the will of seasoned veterans from any other species. Not only does he show no stress response, but he consistently outperforms our expectations by treating each crisis as an information-gathering opportunity." Director Imel, a massive Thurian whose rocky hide was etched with the ceremonial markings of his people, rumbled his concern. Are we certain this isn't some form of genetic engineering? A military enhancement program, perhaps? Dr. Sarah Okafor, representing humanity on the research team, shook her head. Director, we verified Mr. Chen's genetic profile extensively. He's completely unmodified, born and raised on Earth's South American continent. His psychological profile indicates a perfectly normal human upbringing, with no special training in stress management or crisis response. Then, how do you explain his capabilities? Asked Counselor Zifa, a graceful Elysian whose silver skin seemed to glow with inner light. The ability to remain calm under mortal threat while simultaneously gathering and analyzing tactical information defies every model of sapient behavior we possess. Dr. Okafor paused, considering her words carefully. Counselors, I believe the issue isn't that Marcus is exceptional. The issue is that we've fundamentally misunderstood human evolutionary psychology. What you're seeing as impossible calm in the face of danger, humans would describe as basic survival instinct. The chamber erupted in confused murmurs as representatives from dozens of species tried to process this information. Dean Ashera called for order, her authority finally quieting the assembly. Dr. Okafor, Dean Ashera said, please explain what you mean by basic survival instinct. Most sapient species evolve on relatively stable worlds. Dr. Okafor began, activating a holographic display that showed Earth's chaotic geological and climate history. Your home planets typically had predictable weather patterns, stable ecosystems, and manageable natural threats. Your ancestors developed intelligence as a way to create more efficient social structures and resource management. The display shifted to show Earth's violent past. Massive volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, ice ages that covered entire continents, and predators that dwarfed anything else in known space. Humans evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill them, Dr. Okafor continued. Our intelligence didn't develop for social cooperation or resource management. It developed as a survival tool against constant, unpredictable, lethal threats. Every day our ancestors survived was because they could think their way out of situations that should have killed them. Ambassador Kreth leaned forward, his four eyes focusing intently on the human researcher. Are you saying that what we perceive as supernatural calm is actually a species-wide adaptation to extreme environmental stress? Exactly. Humans don't panic because panic is counterproductive when you're facing existential threats on a regular basis. We develop the ability to think clearly under pressure because thinking clearly was literally the difference between life and death. Commander Thex's scarred features showed something approaching awe. That would explain why he treats every crisis as a puzzle to be solved rather than a threat to be feared. It also explains the sleeping incident, Dr. Vex added, his crystalline form brightening with understanding. His subconscious mind was performing threat assessment while he slept because that's exactly what human brains evolved to do. They never truly shut down their survival monitoring systems. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Okafor was correct, then humans weren't just another sapient species joining galactic civilization. They were the survivors of a world so hostile that it had forged them into something entirely different from every other form of intelligent life in the galaxy. What does this mean for humanity's integration into galactic society? Asked Director Imel, his rocky voice carrying undertones of concern. Before Dr. Okafor could answer, the chamber's emergency communication system activated. A priority message appeared on every display transmitted from the Galactic Communication Network. Priority alert. Hostile contact confirmed in the Epsilon Eridani system. Unknown species demonstrates aggressive capabilities beyond current threat assessment models. All available vessels respond immediately. The chamber fell silent as representatives absorbed this information. Hostile first contact was rare, but not unknown. However, the phrase beyond current threat assessment models was deeply troubling. Dean Ashera immediately activated the Academy's command protocols. All senior staff to stations. We need to prepare for potential evacuation procedures. But Dr. Okafor noticed something interesting. While every other species representative in the chamber had immediately shifted into crisis mode, their breathing accelerated. Their postures became defensive. Their voices carried stress. Marcus Chun, who had been quietly observing the session from the back of the chamber, hadn't changed at all. Marcus, Dr. Okafor called out. What's your assessment of his situation? Every head in the chamber turned to look at the human student, who remained seated casually in his chair. It's interesting, Marcus said thoughtfully, but not necessarily as dangerous as it sounds. How can you possibly say that? Demanded Ambassador Kreth. An unknown hostile species with advanced capabilities represents an existential threat to galactic civilization. Marcus shrugged. Maybe, but the message said beyond current threat assessment models, not beyond our defensive capabilities. That suggests we're dealing with something unexpected rather than something insurmountable. Unknown doesn't automatically mean unstoppable. He stood and walked to the central display, completely unbothered by the stares of 47 different species. Besides, if they were really as dangerous as everyone seems to think, would they be operating in just one system? Advanced hostile species typically show multiple incursions or broader territorial expansion patterns. Commander Thex found himself nodding involuntarily. The human's tactical analysis was sound. What do you think we should do? Dean Ashera asked, genuinely curious about Marcus's recommendation. Gather more information, Marcus said without hesitation. We know almost nothing about these aliens, their capabilities, their motivations, or their technology. Making strategic decisions based on one brief encounter report would be premature. But what if they attack while we're gathering information? Asked Counselor Zifa. Marcus looked at her with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious. Then we respond to the attack. But preparing for every possible threat scenario before we understand what we're actually facing is a waste of resources and energy. The chamber fell quiet as the assembly processed this. Here was a student, barely out of his teenage years by human standards, calmly analyzing what every other species in the galaxy considered a potential civilization and in crisis. Dr. Okafor, Dean Ashera, said slowly, I believe we need to seriously discuss humanity's role in galactic defense initiatives. Dr. Okafor nodded. I think Marcus just demonstrated exactly why that's necessary. While we're all panicking about unknown threats, he's already moved past fear to strategic planning. It's not that I'm not concerned, Marcus clarified, apparently sensing the mood in the room. If these aliens really are hostile and really are as advanced as the report suggests, that could be very bad for everyone. But fear doesn't help us solve problems. Understanding does. Ambassador Kreth looked around the chamber, noting the stress responses still visible in representatives from every species except humanity. How many other humans think like this? All of us, pretty much, Marcus said casually. I mean, individuals have different strengths and approaches, but this is basic human problem solving. When something threatens you, you figure out what it is, how it works, and how to deal with it. Panic is something that happens when you don't understand the threat or don't have the tools to handle it. The chamber remained silent for a long moment as the implications sank in. Humanity hadn't just joined galactic civilization. They had potentially brought the galaxy its first species with a genuine evolutionary adaptation to crisis management. I think, Dean Asher said finally, we need to have a very different conversation about humanity's contributions to galactic society. Marcus nodded agreeably. Sure, but maybe we should start by sending some scouts to check out this situation in Epsilon Eridani. All this theoretical discussion is interesting, but we still need to know what's actually happening out there. As the assembly began planning their response to the crisis, every representative in the chamber had the same thought. Perhaps the galaxy had been missing something crucial about the nature of survival, intelligence, and courage. And perhaps humanity had just shown them what they had been missing. The sleeping human had awoken something in galactic civilization, and nothing would ever be quite the same.